Hello everyone, Ili from Lycookies here. Today I'm going to be showing you how to add enemies to your game using UPB game engine. This here is the product from our last tutorials, and so far we have third-person mouse look, movement in every direction, and a jumping animation. I think it's time for us to make our first enemy. So Shift A to add a cube, and this will be our enemy. I want first to start the display keys and rename the cube to enemy. So before we run into the life cycle of the enemy, I would like to say what I want it to be for the enemies in the game. So basically they will be zombie cubes which will seek for the main character, and when they collide with the player, of course they will deal damage to him, and the player will of course have a health property, and when this health property runs down to 0 or below, of course the player will die. The same property will apply to the enemies. So let's get right into it. The first thing you want to do is change the physics of the enemy from static to dynamic, and then add a near sensor. This will define how far is the player from the enemy. So here we have two distance boxes. The first one is the distance we sense the target object. As long as I want it to be active from every point in the map, I will enter a big number like 1000, and this here, the reset distance, is the distance from which the sensor is able to reset, to update. So I will enter even larger number, 2000. So we have the distances, but we don't have the target. Here you can see that the sensor wants us to enter a property, so we will add a property to our player, which will be named, guess what, player, and it will be boolean. Okay, so what's boolean? Boolean is a type of data which is actually with two optional values, 0 or 1, or true or false, or sometimes people say that there's a raised flag or a flag down. So this here is the default value of the property, which is basically the initial value of the property. So when we start the game, this value, which we define here, will be the value of the property. So we want it to be true. So we will add one more property, and it will be health property, and it will be integer type, and the default value will be 100. So guess what, this is the health property, and the value of the health property is 100. So the other types of data here, the other types of property is, well, boolean is true or false, integer is a number but a whole number, float is a number as well but with a floating point, and string is plain text, and of course timer is a timer. So here we use these two, and now as we have our player property, we will go back here to the enemy and type player. the name of the property we're searching for. So we can sense the player with this logic brick, but now we will have the behavior. We will choose the steering actuator, which will basically seek for the player. So now the behavior here is seek for the purpose of this video. There are also flee and path following. Path following behavior is when you have a path object and you can say that you can make the current object follow the path object. So we have a flee behavior, which is of course the opposite of seek. It runs away from the target object. Here we can define the target object, which will be player, and eventually the navigation mesh, but we don't use the path following. Yeah, this here is distance, so how far from the target object the current object will stop. We have the velocity, which is the speed of the current object, acceleration of the current object, and the turn speed of the current object. This will be used when we have facing true. The facing is actually whether or not the current object is face oriented to the target object, and we can define which is the face side of the current object here. In our case it will be the negative y, so this is the positive y, so the negative y will be this face here. Alright, so everything fine here, and you can see that if I press P, nothing happens because this is because we entered flee and we have to enter seek. So you can see that it seeks for the player wherever the players go, when the player goes. So yeah, let's continue with the life cycle of the enemy. So now we will have to damage the enemy. So we will have a collision. This collision block seeks for property or material. We will choose material because we will send a projectile, or actually projectiles, to it, and we will make their materials. So now when we have this collision here, which we will define in a minute, the property of health, which we still don't have and we will make now, so health. Don't confuse the two, this is the health of the enemy. The player also has a health property. So first we will make enemy property, enemy, and it will be boolean as well as the player property. So here is health property again, and it will be integer and it will be 100. Now we have the health property and we will add to it -10 with every projectile that hits the enemy. So everything clear here except for the material of the object. So now we will add a cube. Oh, sorry. So Alt C, Shift C. Okay, right. Now we will add a cube, which will be our projectile, and we will move it to the second layer for now. Make its shape however you want. So let's say like this. Alright, I will give it a material and the material will be called Projectile. And the name of the object will be Projectile as well. Of course, I will give it a nice color. And now I will move it again to the first layer. And here, when I select the enemy, I can define the projectile material, and everything here is done. So now when we have this collision, so the collision with the projectile, we want the projectile to end. So end object. We are adding the end object brick in the projectile logic bricks because we are not able to define the object we want to end. So by default, Blender understands that where if you put this end object logic brick in this object's logic bricks, it will end this particular object. So now we will add an end controller and we will connect them with the collision sensor. So basically now we want to move it again to the second layer and make its physics to ghost and collision bounds are available, and we also want to make its behavior, so we want it to always move forward. So y will be, let's say, 4. Alright, so now on the player side we will have to call the projectile. So here will be the mouse sensor, and we will leave it to left button, and we will add an edit object actuator and connect the two. And of course we will call the projectile object. And alright, one last thing, we will make the physics of the enemy here, collision bounds. You want to check that. Alright, so press P to play, and you can see that the projectile disappears when it hits the enemy. So now we want to check if the property of health is equal to 0 or better. We want to check it if it's less than 1, because, well, trust me on this, and if you have a game that you have to you have death, of course, you have health properties, you want to use this here, less than 1, because if it's less than 1 then it's 0 or below. Like you know that we can, if my player has 25 HP and you have 50 damage, it will never equal, my health will never be equal to 0. It will be less than 0, so you escape some errors there. Alright, so when it's less than 1, we have to end the object. End object. Alright, so let's see if we can kill. Alright, we killed the enemy. Alright, so now we want to do the same for the player. This will be the last thing for this tutorial, and it's basically the same as the enemy. So now we want to make a collision again. Collision, and the property will be player. Not the projectile, but player. And then if it's collided with player, it will, let's select this here, the player, and if it's collided with player, the player will take damage. So player is here, and the player will have its property of health. So the health property will be added with -5, let's say. Alright, so where was that? Here, it's here. Okay, so we add an end controller, connect the property actuator, and connect it with the collision sensor of the enemy, which again it collides with the player. And we can define the attack speed of the enemy here when you press true level triggering, and by default the frame rate of the Blender game engine is 60 frames per second. So now if I enter here 60, a tick will be caused in every second. So alright, so every second the zombie cube is collided with the player, it will cause damage to the player. So let's try this. Oh, nothing will happen actually, because we never made the death of the player. However bad that sounds. So we can check if the player's property health is less than 1. Then edit object, and object. Alright, so let's see. Pick to play, and we will see if the player will die. Okay, the player died. Alright, so maybe you have the question of why do I have the collision sensor here instead of in the player's logic bricks. Well, it's because when I have multiple enemies, each one of them will affect the player's health. But if it's the other way, if the collision with the enemy is in the player's logic bricks, it will only cast on a single thread. So yeah, if we make several enemies, which we'll do in the next tutorial. We will get damage from all of them. So yeah, speaking of the next tutorial, well, this is the end of this tutorial. I know it's a bit longer than usual, but again, the project file will be on my GitHub. All the links will be in the description. If you want any tutorials to happen, just comment down below or whatever. Please leave a like, subscribe and share, and you can consider helping me with Patreon. And see you in the next tutorial, where we will have a spawner for enemies, and the enemies will be multiple, of course, and we will have to fight several enemies. Of course, we will have to make a gold system, which will be also in the next tutorial, and we will display all the properties on the screen, speaking of health and gold. And yeah, see you then.